afternoon. Today we are going to be talking about how to rebut. So we've already considered how to address and find a fallacy in the opposition's argument. If you haven't seen that video, please click here and you will be able to find it. Now the golden rules of rebuttal are that you should rebut every point that the opposition makes at least once. If you don't rebut it during the debate, it will stand no matter how poorly argued it was. So you must rebut every single point. The second rule that I have for rebuttal is that if you're rebutting the same point again within the debate, that is, if you or another speaker has already rebutted the point that you're about to rebut, then you do need to change the content of the rebut it in a different way. Third rule is that you are sharing rebuts among your team and that you figure out a consistent way to write down your rebuts so that you can share them without worrying too much about everybody's handwriting. Now, the idea behind rebuttal is very simple. It's just pointing out a way in which the other team are wrong. There are 6 main ways that you can tackle rebuts. There are other ways as well, but these are the 6 main ones. You can identify a fallacy, you can reject the premise of the argument, you can reject the conclusion of the argument, you can deny a link, you can make an even if rebuttal, or you can rebut practicalities. The strongest rebut there is usually an even if rebut. So if you have already rejected the premise of the argument and the conclusion of the argument, then an even if rebut is one that argues even if the point made by the opposition were true, then it still wouldn't work in the real world, and taking that through. That's usually the second rebut that comes out on the same point, and is usually done by the third speaker. We're going to look at a few examples in a moment. So here we have the process of the rebut. We start with, do you understand the argument? Then ask yourself, can you identify a fallacy? Then, is the premise of the argument true? Is the conclusion of the argument true? Is the point relevant to the debate? And does the point support the case? And by following this process, you should be able to come up with a rebut for anything. So now we're going to practice. I have here these scrolls. Would you please pick one? No. Yep. Yep.
The voting age should be lowered to 12 years so that students can have active participation in creating policies that affect them and political discourse can improve.
Okay. So, do we understand the argument? Yes. Can you identify a fallacy? Do you want to read it again, please?
The voting age should be lowered to 12 years so that students can have active participation in creating policies that affect them and political discourse can improve.
Okay. So, can we identify a fallacy?
Political discourse is not necessarily going to improve if we lower the voting age.
That's true, but it might come up in a moment because, I mean, can you identify a fallacy? Remember when we talked about fallacies?
What's a fallacy where it's like this thing doesn't necessarily lead to another?
Can you remember what it's called?
No.
That's okay. You don't really need to know what it's called just to be able to do that. Basically, yes, you can identify a fallacy in which the link isn't established between the premise and the conclusion. But let's look at each of those in turn. So, yes, we can identify a fallacy, so we can say the one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. Pointing it out in your speech, you can basically just be very straightforward about it. Just say, we don't think that there is necessarily a link between the premise of this argument and the conclusion of this argument. Alright, so is the premise of the argument true? What's the premise?
The voting age should be lowered because, the premise is the voting age should be lowered.
No, that's the proposal. What do we think the premise is?
I mean that they'll have active participation in the policy that affect them.
Excellent. So the argument is having that people who vote have active participation in the policies that affect them. Now, do we think that the premise, that argument, is true?
No.
Okay. Why isn't it true? We've gone to no, and then we have to establish that with facts. How do we know that that's true?
Because everyone over 18 can vote, but not everyone over 18 is active in politics and knows lots of stuff.
Excellent, very good. Okay, so we've established that with facts. I should say that at any point, if you've been able to make a point of rebuttal, you can step off. If you keep hitting dead ends with this, then you might go all the way to the end. But essentially, with each time you rebut a point, you really only need to rebut it in one or maybe two ways. If you are the first or second speaker, then your third speaker can come back and rebut it in a different way taken from later on in the chart. So at this point, we have thoroughly rebutted that. We've saying it has failed to establish a link and the premise of the argument is untrue. But for the purposes of this, let's continue. Is the conclusion of the argument true?
No.
What's the conclusion of the argument?
That political discourse will improve.
That political discourse will improve. Okay, so we can say that's no. Can you establish that with an explanation?
Because political discourse is good now, so involving a whole bunch of like younger teenagers will not necessarily make politicians who are adults want to up their political game.
Yes, exactly, right. So just because more people will be involved in the voting process doesn't necessarily mean that it will improve, as we know that young people, 18, 19 and 20-year-olds aren't necessarily more politically involved because they have the right to vote. Well done. And then, is the point relevant to the debate? Yes? Yeah.
Seems to be.
This one, if you've gotten this far, it'll usually be true, but it's possible that it'll be irrelevant, and if that is true, it's useful for your team to point that out. And then, yes, and does the point support the case? If we imagine that the case in this will be that we want to improve the democracy in our country, and therefore we should take the steps to lower the voting age.
No.
No. Okay, good. And then we can establish this with an explanation again, and then if you really want to devastate the argument further, you can finish on running an even if rebut, which we talked about earlier. Let's pick another one. Yep.
That parents should protect children from watching the news because it is often violent and graphic and children should not have to see these images.
Okay, so that parents should protect children from watching the news because it is often violent and graphic and children should be protected. Do you understand the argument?
Yes.
Can you identify a fallacy?
Is it appealing to emotion?
I think that might well be the case. It's an emotional argument, basically, that children are innocent, sweet things and that anything graphic will affect them badly. So yes, you'd start your rebut by saying that this argument, it appeals strongly to emotion, but let's examine the facts of this. I usually proceed even after you've identified a fallacy. Identifying a fallacy is not a rebut. You do need to go further than that. However, it's actually very helpful for your case if you're able to say, this is a slippery slope argument, or this appeals a lot to emotion, because it establishes that it's not a logical progression necessarily. Okay, can you identify a fallacy? Yes, so that was appeal to emotion. Very good. Is the premise of the argument true? Which one's the premise?
Watching the news is often violent and graphic.
Watching the news is violent and graphic. Is the premise of that true?
Well, you could say yes, but they often, like, before a really violent and graphic thing, they'll come up with a warning and say, like, some images may disturb some viewers, so it's not necessarily for all people. You can just walk out of the room.
Good reasoning. Very good. So we say that it is true, but there are safeguards within this. It is very powerful in rebuttal to concede. So you can say, it is true that the news is violent and graphic. This means that it shows that you're listening to the point, it shows that you are engaged, and it shows that even if a premise is true, there's more to be said about the validity of the argument. So we can say, yes, this is true, however, as you rightly say, there are usually warnings. Alright, is the conclusion of the argument true? We identified the conclusion there.
Children should not have to see these images?
Children should not have to see these images. Yes, basically. We can extrapolate from that. It doesn't have to be the exact wording of the point. So the idea behind that is that seeing these images would be detrimental to children. So do we think that that conclusion is true?
No,
No?
because it will help to educate them about the world around them and the world that they're growing up in.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter if they're children, eventually they're going to have to be older and they're going to have to deal with this. So it's better that they start off when they're a little bit younger and understand from an earlier age what's going on around them.
Well explained, yes. Is the point relevant to the debate?
Yes.
Yes. Does the points support the case, which is
No.
presumably
No.
no? Can you explain why?
It doesn't support the case. Because we proved it did. No.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. You can definitely say that. If we come to this this question, you can either use it as a conclusion to your rebuttal, saying that therefore, because of these reasons which we have outlined, this doesn't support their case, or you can argue that it's not actually relevant to their case. If it's not relevant to the debate in the first instance, you might find that it doesn't support their overall case. For instance, in this case, it might be their overall case is that children should be protected, but as the opposition, you could say that children aren't being protected by being forced into ignorance, and therefore this doesn't support their case as a whole. Well done. And that is good use. This time we're going to pick one of these ones, and I just want one identification from the list of how you might rebut it. So instead of going through every point, which is absolutely unnecessary in debating, you really only need to use one point of rebuttal or two, the strongest that you can find. So let's practice that. No worries.
That magazine should show when an image is photoshopped, because without these young girls being tricked into participating in unhealthy eating habits.
Okay. So magazines should show when the images are photoshopped because this forces young girls into unhealthy eating habits. Can you identify where you might take this rebuttal? The premise? Okay, so what's the premise?
That if an image is going to be photoshopped, young girls should know.
Sure, that's the proposal. The premise of the argument, do we know, Amelia?
Is that they'll get unhealthy eating habits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the premise of the argument is that having a misleading image causes unhealthy eating habits, right? That's the basis of the argument. It's read as fact and then the argument proceeds from there. So we can say that, and take it from here.
That simply because an image is photoshopped doesn't necessarily mean that they'll form unhealthy eating habits. Like, there isn't a certain link between them. Like, there are many other factors that can form unhealthy eating factors.
Excellent. There are many other factors that can form these, and so we could say that the argument is an oversimplification of the facts. All right, let's try. Which one would you like?
That any online game usage should have an age minimum of 10 years old, because under this age, brains are still developing and could be damaged by games.
Okay, so the under 10-year-olds shouldn't be allowed to play any online games because that would be damaging to their brains. What element could we rebut from here? Yes?
Well, the conclusion isn't true.
Okay, yeah. So the conclusion of the argument, which one's that?
That's the bit where they said if they're playing video games, it's going to damage their brains because they're too young.
Yeah.
And that's not true, because a lot of video games that I played anyway before I was 10 were all educational ones. So they were ones teaching you how to add, how to subtract, all of those really fun things. So if you take that away, you're actually taking away a very valuable educational tool rather than removing a potential source of damage.
Perfect. Perfectly rebutted. That's exactly how we do that one. Alright.
Additionally, the brain doesn't stop developing at 10. Like, it continues to develop. So why should we stop at the age? Why should it be okay at the age of 10?
Perfect. So in that one, if, for instance, we came out early on in the debate and said that video games that are appropriate for under 10-year-olds are actually help development, and then later on in the debate, perhaps at third speaker, you could say, earlier in the debate we rebutted this on the basis of the content of games, but similarly we know that the brain is still developing until you're
30. It's like 32 or something.
32. Well, many people think that the brain just continues to develop, but definitely at least until the age of 25. And that way you've rebutted it once early on in your first two speakers, and then again in your third speaker, but from a different angle. And that makes your rebutting of the point far more effective. Thank you for watching.